Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us to try to unpack this complicated issue. What we hope to do this afternoon is to bring some sanity around the conversation and try to discern between reality and perception. So in late September, I was asleep one night, and my phone rings around 12:30 a.m., which is a little alarming. And I answer the phone, and it's the BBC. And they say, there was a shooting in the back of the Yards neighborhood. I'm like, I was asleep. I have no idea what you're talking about. They said, well, would you mind coming on at 4:45 in the morning to talk about Chicago violence and to talk about this shooting? I said, well, I don't know anything about this shooting. I have been asleep. I can talk in general themes about violence in Chicago. And they said, sure. So, I had a choice. I really did not want to get up that early. And I also knew why they were calling me. It's not because I'm this fantastic journalist. There's one reason they were calling me: Barack Obama. That sounds a little simplistic, but I think a lot of the Chicago violence that we are hearing about nationally, I'm sure when any of you all go out of town, people are saying, oh my God, what is happening in Chicago? Chicago Magazine did a roundup of international coverage of Chicago violence. And there's one common denominator in all of this, and it's Barack Obama's hometown. So I said to myself, I will go on, and in these 3 minutes that they're going to talk to me, I will try to explain some of the violence. Now, mind you, this is a global audience. Why would BBC Global care about a shooting in which no one died? Barack Obama. So I'm talking to them, and the first question is, so Barack Obama's hometown. So this isn't something that I just have made up. I often do get calls from other media entities asking me about it, and then they go into Chicago's gang problem is out of control. So I try to say my usual things like, okay, segregation, there's poverty, this all isn't gang violence, and yes, Barack Obama is from here. So that's my little contribution, but it's very frustrating as a reporter because you want to show the humanity in people that goes beyond the who got shot last night.
Great. So yes, so as we investigate this topic, how violent is Chicago, it's very, very important for us to look at the landscape of crime in general in Chicago. And we can kind of categorize crime in two ways, two categories. The first would be property crime. That is approximately 80% of all crime that exists in this city. The other 20% can be categorized as violent crime. And in that violent crime, that 20% of overall crime, violent crime is broken down into about 4 or 5 categories. About half of the violent crime would be categorized as robbery. About another 30% would be what we call aggravated battery. That's where someone there was some type of altercation that was violent. Doesn't always necessarily lead to an injury. Then you have aggravated assault, which would be about 16% of that 20%. And then the last 2 categories would be the major categories that most people focus on, particularly in the media. So you're talking about 4% of the crime, of the violent crime, is considered or categorized as criminal sexual assault. And 1.4% of that violent crime would be homicides. So in the homicides, 1.4%, if you look overall with crime in Chicago, less than 1% of the crime is homicide or a shooting that leads to a homicide. It's a very small percentage, very rare occurrence in the city. But when you turn on the television, what happens? We're inundated with that violence. Now, even look at it even more specifically. You want to look at how it affects the city in general. So you know our city is basically broken up into about 77 different neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods, as Natalie mentioned, are highly segregated. And so when you look at the neighborhoods, we can look at the neighborhoods based on race and ethnicity. And as it relates to violence, you're basically talking about 20 to 25, but maybe even 15 of these neighborhoods, which are essentially all of them, of the 20, I would say, that have the highest rates of homicide, are predominantly African American. That's 90% and up. I think one of them, Humboldt Park, is predominantly Hispanic. But even Humboldt Park has a significant population of African Americans. So when you look at the neighborhoods that are predominantly white, then you have no homicides. You have no murder. So when we talk about homicides, the thing that resonates with most people in this city in terms of violent crime, you're talking about something that occurs in predominant African American communities among a population of African American males, young African American males between the ages of 15 and 35, who have not gone to school, who don't have jobs. That's the population. And even in communities like the community that I live in, Washington Park, you have some areas of Washington Park that have not had a homicide or even violent crime in the last 10 years or so. But then you have, so you will have one block where there is peace, and then another block where you have high rates of violence. So the last thing I will say in this area, always pay attention to a rate versus the number. That is critical, because the city plays with these numbers, and it plays on the emotions that is attached to homicide and violence. So the rate is a number that standardizes a crime across populations. So let's say one community may have 3,000 residents, another one may have 15. Well, if you say there were 20 homicides in the 3,000, that's a much bigger problem than one that has, 20,000 people with 2. Or vice versa. So you have to understand the rate. The rate tells you how much something occurs across population. And a lot of times the city will play with the numbers. They will tell you that the homicides are down. But what they don't tell you is that the population is down as well. So if the population decreases in Chicago, violence is down, homicides are down. But guess what? Population is down as well, particularly among African Americans throughout the city. So we've lost about 7% of the African American population in Chicago. So automatically that's going to take the rate down. Or automatically the numbers may be even higher. So in some of these communities, rates are high, the numbers are down, and I'm not sure if that really, we'll talk about that a little further, but the rates and the numbers are two different things, and always pay attention to them as you discuss this deal as we talk about violence.
So Chicago has historically been a very violent city. This did not start in 2008. It did not start last year. It goes back decades to our history of corruption and bootlegging and the mob and Al Capone. So when Lance talks about murder rate and murder numbers, and this gets confusing because this is what we are seeing on social media. This is what we will see tomorrow morning on the news. They will talk about what happened over the weekend. So Chicago had more murders than any other city last year at 500. But Chicago does not have the highest murder rate in the country. And often there's a lot of misinformation that goes on. Like Chicago is one of the most violent cities in the world, hardly. It is also not the most violent city in the Midwest. So if you stack up those FBI numbers, Chicago has a murder rate of about, is it 14?
It's between 14 and 18 per 100,000.
And so the cities that actually have more, that have higher murder rates in the United States, according to FBI data, would be Atlanta, Philadelphia, Baltimore, St. Louis, New Orleans, and Detroit. And I think we would all be pretty hard pressed to name any murder that has happened in any of those cities, or to talk about any of the coverage. There was actually a student at Columbia College where I moderated a panel recently, and he said, you know, there are a lot of murders in New Orleans, but the media does not cover it like this. We don't cover violence. And, you know, I think there are questions about whether that is good or whether that is bad, but, you know, as a media practitioner, I have found that these numbers don't really tell a story. They're just these tallies that we are constantly hearing. So, you know, just thinking out loud with this student on this panel, I said, you know, what would happen if the media just decided not to cover any murders at all in Chicago? And if there was just more coverage in these communities. So there is something in common. It has nothing to do with, you know, Black people being pathological, even though these murders are happening in Black neighborhoods. These neighborhoods have a lot in common: deindustrialization, high unemployment rates, high poverty, high children in poverty, nary a place to grocery shop. And, you know, these are the systemic problems of disinvestment that happen that create this breeding ground for violence.
Absolutely. So when you look at what is actually going on in these neighborhoods, it's really interesting. The World Health Organization did a study about a year and a half ago, that looked at the highest rates of violence globally. And they found that in sub-Saharan Africa is where you find the highest rates of violence, highest rates of violent crime. And it's really interesting because when you look at those rates and you compare them to the hot spots in the African American communities in this city, the rates are almost exactly the same. So basically, we're looking at a city that has third world living conditions in some aspects of some areas of this city. And so as we're out there working with young people, young men, and I've been working with young men for my whole profession, you know, going close to 30 years. And I've never seen among young men, particularly young African-American males, the high levels of depression. Although there's no health care there, and guys are not walking around saying that they're clinically depressed, but when you look at their behaviors, you'll see that there's high levels of depression, despair, hopelessness that's playing out in violence, like really simple stuff. Like looking at someone the wrong way or calling someone out of their name leads to gunplay. And the city then will refer to this. So when we hear it on the news, it's gang related. And unless you really know the dynamics of the community and the individuals in the community, you will believe it because it sounds like, well, this guy was affiliated with the Gangster Disciples. But do you know who generally kills Gangster Disciples?
Other gangster disciples.
Other gangster disciples. So how is that gang related? Generally, if it's gang related, it's a hierarchical kind of hit where a gangster disciple says, go kill a Blackstone. But that's not how it plays out. It plays out in the frustration because, yes, a lot of these guys self-identify with street organizations. But what happens is because of the fact that they haven't gone to school since elementary school, they don't have jobs, and they know pretty much, you know, their lives are over with at an early age. And so they're drinking and they're drugging, and it leads to gunplay because they have easy access to guns. So then that plays out in somebody getting killed because someone got called out of their name. Real simple. But it's really because the guy was depressed and he reacted in a negative way. And so in the neighborhoods, we're looking at people who are living in third world conditions in an international city.
And the other thing with gang-related and gang-affiliated, so I've done some reporting on this and have given pushback to the police department. I think it's just very easy for whether it's the media or the police, when you say gang-related, a lot of times people check out mentally. Well, those are deserving people. They are fighting among each other. You know, it's just something that's happening down on the south side or the west side. And when we're in this segregated environment, it's just becomes, well, those people down there doing that thing. And when you just start to, peel back and find out why some of these incidences are happening, they really tend to be interpersonal relationships. A lot of beef are over girlfriends. It can be over something minor like a gambling debt or honking your car too loudly on a block that's unfamiliar, and there's this sense of, oh, here's this outsider, or here's somebody I know who is disrespecting me. And those individuals may or may not be in a gang, and the gang structure of today is completely different than the one we saw in the 1980s and early 1990s. A lot of what we're seeing on the streets are street crews. So, 1, 2, 3, 4 block Cornell boys, or, just making up different names. But we see a lot of street crews that are forming on a block by block basis that may not have an official affiliation with the gang. And the law enforcement 20 years ago put a lot of the head leaders in prison. So that left a lot of renegade sects. You also had the destabilization of the drug economy. Now, a lot of people will blame the CHA high-rises as to contributing to all the violence that's happening in the neighborhoods, including people who live in some of those neighborhoods. Now, that's not to say there hasn't been destabilization, but these areas were so neglected by the city that they were open-air drug markets, not necessarily by residents in those locations, but they just were what they were. And then when those high-rises came down, you had some displaced drug dealers who now want to set up shop in other neighborhoods, or guys who end up becoming freelance drug dealers because they're trying to find their post when there may be an existing drug crew already in place.
So I want to just do a lead-in to bring Zari into the discussion. I think the interpersonal conflict that exists in these communities is really what drives the violence. And so, Zari, if you can talk about how you and your work with Project Orange Tree came into existence, then maybe we can follow with a specific example of how all of this stuff plays out.
Okay, as he said, I'm Zari Kepra, and I'm a president of Project Orange Tree. It's a youth-led violence awareness campaign, organization that was started in honor of Hadia Pendleton. I don't know if you all are familiar, but she went to the same school as me, and she was killed, because of gun violence. When her story went onto the news, they labeled it as gang affiliated. I knew her personally, and a lot of the people that were there as well, and I knew that they were not related to any gang in any way. It hurt me deeply, and everyone that I was around, that someone would mark her as gang related, because when I saw things like that on the news, I automatically thought, oh, that's nothing to do with me. Like, I won't be in that same situation because I don't participate in any gang related activities. When they did that to her, I felt like they were dehumanizing someone that I was very close to, and it hurt me very bad. So, in a peace discussion that we started for Hadia, just to talk about violence, we had a couple of youth from King, from Lindblom, all come together to talk about violence itself. And there was questions invoked about what violence is, how we can stop it, and what do we think caused it. And through those questions, some of the youth that were on the panel felt very invigorated, and they felt like they actually could do something about it. And that's how Project Orange Tree was started. Project Orange Tree's name comes from orange, the color that hunters wear when they go hunting to show that they're not the enemy. And tree as like protection and family, something that can grow. So we put it together to basically say we didn't want to be the next victim of gun violence in Chicago. The common threat that we were going against was structural violence, which feeds from some of the components that Natalie and Lance already talked about, which is food deserts, institutionalized racism, and failing school systems. All of these little components come together to basically cause direct violence, which is gun violence, rape, things like that. But all of these small things feed into that. So we started a campaign which ranged from April 1st to April 4th. And through those days, we wore orange every day. And we fasted from sunup to sundown to basically say we didn't want to be the next victim, and also to symbolize us dining with the deceased who can no longer eat. So during this time, we thought of different ideas that we can do and like different events that we can plan so that we can stop structural violence in Chicago, so that we can minimize direct violence so no one else could feel the pain that we felt when Hadia died. So we did an event we did a candlelight vigil where we honored all of the people that died in 2013. We did a Trayvon Martin case discussion where we talked about like the small details that were involved in it. We had community events where we talked to different organizations and different people who had ideas about things that we can do in our community to stop gun violence. We also are planning a food drive to stop some of the food deserts in Chicago, which are small places or areas that don't have access to organic foods or any healthy type of foods. So we're going to raise canned goods and then match it with fresh food and disperse it into the small communities that are food deserts, like Inglewood, Washington Park, and things of that sort. And the most crazy thing about Project Orange Tree is some of the members who started it, we were all people that felt like we weren't affected by violence because we didn't participate in any gang-affiliated activities, even though we lived in areas like Washington Park, Inglewood, and things of that sort. We still felt like we were invincible, but when it hit so close to home, we felt like we had to make a change so that no one else would have to feel the same pain that we were feeling. And for those people who also were affected before Hadia's death, that they would feel as if someone else cared, that someone actually understood, and we can prevent things from happening like that. So that's how Project Orange Tree got started.
And I want to also explain like why the label can be so harmful. So some of you may remember Mark Hurt proposed earlier this year that to stop violence in Chicago, we should round up 18,000 gangster disciples at a cost of, I forgot what $1 million figure. And, Bobby Rush called him an elite white boy who didn't know what he was talking about. The two kissed and made up, and Bobby Rush told the senator, I'm going to take you around to Inglewood so you can meet residents and hear what they have to say. So I was the one reporter who was allowed to tag along and sit in on the community meeting. And I have to say it was one of the most bizarre experiences I've ever had as a reporter. And I'm not saying that to sound partisan. I'm not part of the liberal media. Mark Hurt was there to listen, and every resident in there talked about jobs over and over again. Nothing really invested in their community. Sure, yes, and Aldi's open, but that's not really good enough. We want something else here for options. And then Mark Hurt raised his hand and said, how many of you all support the Gangster Disciples? And no one raised their hand. He was like, see, the community doesn't support the Gangster Disciples. And the residents were very offended because Mark Kirk still kept talking about we're gonna round up Gangster Disciples. And every resident in there said the Gangster Disciples are not the problem in Inglewood. Jobs are the problem in Inglewood. And he was like, nope, Gangster Disciples, gonna lock them up. So if this is a senator who is representing all of Illinois and, who it was clear had never been to Inglewood before based on some of the other comments that he made, not listening to the residents and have this lock them up approach. I don't even know how, the Chicago Crime Commission puts out this big book of gang members, and Lance can talk more about how the people in there are dead or their pictures are used twice. And it's completely outdated, and it's something that's really laughed among, whether it's an academic circle, law enforcement, street circles. But if, our people in charge are, drumming this, have this drumbeat about gangs, and let's just lock up 18,000 young black men, and this will solve all of our problems of violence in Chicago. And, in a lot of these discussions, we are not even hearing from young people about what they want out of their communities. how they are portrayed. There's a lot of criminalization of young people in this city based on how they look, on what their fashion is, that has nothing to do with substance.
Yeah, in the neighborhoods, this is what happens. A group of guys, they get up about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, because they don't have jobs, so they sleep in. 2 or 3 o'clock, we come out and start hanging out on the block. Maybe about 5 or 6 you may have in a neighborhood like 8 Trade, which is one of the sets, Blackstone sets that we write about in a book. You may have as many as 200 or 300 guys in that neighborhood who don't have jobs, who haven't been past, the first or second year of high school. And they're just hanging out. And pretty soon, there's a little money generated to buy a little weed, to buy a little drink. Maybe about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, guys are fully, gone, particularly with the kind of weed that they're smoking these days. I mean, I don't know what it is. I don't know if you've been in the hood lately, but you can smell it for blocks away.
It's called loud.
They call it loud and what else? Skunk, and they got all kind of names. Nevertheless, so you get guys that are around and they're talking stuff to each other, and some guy is just not in a good mood. And because manhood plays a central part of this, identity plays a central part of this, someone gets their manhood offended. And in the hood, that's the last thing that can happen to you, emasculate. You already feel less than a man because you can't provide for yourself. You're a grown man, but you're living at home with your mother. You're living with your grandmother. And so you're emasculated, and the last thing that you have is your little, what you call your manhood, which is purely physical at this time. And so when you get challenged, you have to stand up. And in many cases, it's not just about whether I can handle myself physically, but it is about whether I can completely dominate this individual that has emasculated me. And that turns into gunplay. And in this particular situation that Nzari talked about with Hadia, the 2 young men who were accused of her shooting, one of them had been shot a few months before. And in his neighborhood, his buddies, although he was a working guy, he went to work every day, he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, got shot. And his buddies basically said, hey, look, man, you have to do something about this. You know who did it. You know the guys from down, the 4 or 6 guys came down here and shot. You need to go handle your business. Now, he didn't want to have anything to do with it. He's already a victim. He wanted to, I got shot and I'm going to move on. But every day when he goes to hang out with his buddies, they're calling him names. You're a punk, you're a sissy, you're a B, you're this, you're that. You need to go handle your business. So one of his guys, who is offended that he's being emasculated, tells him, look, let's go handle this. I'll go with you if you're scared. The goal was really to go down on the other end, the other side of the low end where they were from, to confront the guys who, it doesn't matter who, but just the fact that you went and got your lick back. But not really being a street guy, they decided to target a group of kids who they knew had no affiliation with a gang. Why? Because they knew if they went to target guys who were gang affiliated, it may be retaliation, and they didn't want problems. So they went to look just to shoot what they call shoot up the spot. And in the process of shooting up the spot to get a story to come back to the block and tell the guys, look, I handled my business, to get them off his back, Hadia was accidentally shot and killed. That's how it goes in the hood, that kind of desperation in these actions where guys are trying to get some form of manhood, and in the process of getting their manhood and their dignity back, people get shot and killed. But then when we hear about it and we see it on the television, it's gang related. It has nothing really to do with gangs. It's just desperation and hopelessness and despair and ignorance and irresponsibility all wrapped up in one. So you think you want to get to some questions or comments?
Yes, I'm looking for, there's a mic that's coming around, and while that comes, you know, just because of our segregated city, the things that we're talking about are just elements of some of these communities. I did a big story for Ebony magazine on Roseland this summer. That was like a 24-hour time stamp of what is happening in the community. That just showing like what's happening at 2 a.m., what's happening at 2 p.m. There's one element of violence that I don't think Lance mentioned, and this violence gets more phone calls than any other violence in Chicago in every neighborhood, and that is domestic violence.
Yes, that's right.
So when we talk about how violent is Chicago, that's not discussed, but that by far would be, I think, supersede any of those other categories of violence, and that, you know, is an equal opportunist.
Yeah.
Secondly,
Can I just weigh in?
Yeah.
So just to show you how bad the domestic violence piece is, you're talking about 60% of all African American women who present to the emergency room are there for some domestic battery type of deal, and no one talks about that at all.
But, you know, Roseland, we hear about that in the news. We, you know, hear about the violence down there. But there's also, you know, humanity in all of these neighborhoods and people who are, I mean, this sounds very simple, but I think it's worth reminding a lot of people when you are only getting these sound bites that these are people who are going to work, want things for their children. You know, there's an area of Roseland that's actually by Fenger High School that has these really beautiful homes. And, you know, you will see Cadillacs in the driveways. So, you know, I'd say that just to illustrate that violence is an element of some of these neighborhoods. One. Two, you have people who are working. I think we're often spoon-fed that, oh, you know, no one's doing anything in these neighborhoods. There are lots of block clubs. There are lots of people doing work, and that story doesn't get told also. But these are, you know, a lot of these are middle-class communities that may be adjacent to areas that aren't as affluent, but there's just breadth that are in these neighborhoods and a lot of economic diversity that are in these neighborhoods, and, you know, everything isn't hopeless or doom and gloom, and unfortunately, that's really how the South Side at large is presented to the masses.
Hi. You know, you talk about other cities, and I have a sister who's a teacher in a New Orleans charter school who recently, she kind of deals with all the non-teaching support for all the students. And they had one of their students was affected by a shooting. She goes, you know, like in Chicago, this is what she says to me, you know, we had a child, like it was the fact that it's innocent, like Hydea, that's where the change is, you know, not young men angry, but when innocent and when the young child was with her father, when the baby was shot, those things, you know, put us in a different light. And I'm not saying that it's not all equally horrific, but it was an interesting response that she made. It kind of leads me to the next thing, having heard a lot of speakers talk about gun violence, and you know, how our mayor wanted to have mandatory sentencing for gun crimes, and the back and forth between, I know there's a huge incarceration problem in that community, and there's a lot of pushback to that, yet I heard another speaker at an earlier session of the Humanities Festival talk about how in New York City, which is a higher population, lower murder rate, where they have mandatory sentencing for gun crimes, they know that if you know, you're not going to get off. And I know it's also harder to get illegal guns in New York State, but how, as a parent, if I was in the community, I would do anything to, you know, save an innocent child. It seems to me one of the most important things is to get guns out, and the idea that you can use a gun where more innocent people are going to get hurt. And I kind of want your take on that argument, the pros and cons of mandatory sentence.
Well, I'll just say in New York, So if we look at the mandatory sentencing versus in New York versus here, that may be one way to look at the reduction of the rates in comparison. That our rates are almost 3 times as high as New York's. But there are some other things, some other factors like the housing policy here in Chicago, which I believe personally contributed greatly to the disrupting the fabric of outlying communities. So when you dismantle public housing and you spread people out to other under-resourced neighborhoods, it caused, it was a ripple effect and disrupted the fabric of these communities, which contributed to violence, in my opinion. New York didn't use that same approach. They had the same process of gentrification, public housing, but what the approach was, instead of spreading people out far and wide and basically kicking people out of neighborhoods that they had lived in intergenerationally, they did the gentrification with folks staying in their neighborhoods and communities. And I think that was really the factor that allowed the violence rates to kind of stay down. You can look at mandatory, you can look at some other things, but I think the housing policy is really what affected how violence played out in the two cities.
I would co-sign that. So, for example, when Harlem and Bronzeville are always compared, when Harlem started being gentrified or redeveloped, they did not dismantle their public housing high-rises there. I also think segregation is not the same on any level the way it is in Chicago. So I think the resources are have and have-nots, and the way some of our neighborhoods look contribute. And that's not to say that New York is perfect, but I do think that their housing policy, as well as just their city policies and just the population and density, play a role into that. I think there's also there's some scholars who question whether mandatory minimums are even the reason that New York has a lower, less of a gun violence problem than we do. I understand the emotion that people say, well, if someone has a gun, just lock them up, that will make everything better. But I think there has to be some deeper examination, and the research isn't really supporting that notion.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this discussion. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about mandatory sentences, but also talks about the terrible toll that the war on drugs has taken on African American men, the fact that it's almost impossible for them to get jobs because they have to check boxes on job applications that say that they have never committed a felony. And given that sort of situation, I wonder how do you expect that this situation can change?
Well, obviously these are structural systemic problems. The economy is at the core of this in a lot of places, and I agree 100% with what Michelle has done in her book. So structurally, in Chicago, can you believe that 90% of African American youth are unemployed? That's just unbelievable, but that is the data, 90%. And so when that's the case, then youth are basically forced to try to find other means to make money, and sometimes it's the underground economy, which leads to the criminalization of that population. Structurally, we were talking about it in the hospitality room. We're in a tough situation because it is so imbalanced right now in terms of the structural problems of the economy, how it affects the community, the school system, the school closures. Now the school closures, that's these almost 50 schools. But this kind of stuff has been going on for the last 10 years. Of closing community schools. When you look at the housing situation, now this whole depression has set in among young people. Even if we went into the neighborhoods right now and dumped jobs, right down in the middle of these neighborhoods, unfortunately, many of, particularly young African American males, don't have the social skill set to even, They're not employable because they are so out of the societal loop for such an extended period of time. So we need kind of a Marshall Plan that's going to have some mental health services that go along with some intensive educational support, some, all of that. And where are the resources going to come to do that? I don't know. But I know in order to solve the problem, it's got to be comprehensive in that kind of way.
Hello. Right here.
Okay.
Okay. There's a hip hop artist named Lecrae Moore who explained the problem of masculinity with the absence of father figures or proper father figures, and he said that that's one of the main reasons why there's such a problem with masculinity, with domestic violence, etc. What do you think about that? And if you can answer, what do you think are some solutions to that?
I think we live in a patriarchal society in general, and we can't just say this is a problem with young black men. I mean, open a magazine, turn on the television. We live in a hyper-masculine, violent society, particularly that plays out in popular culture. So, for me, I think about education, media literacy, trying to dismantle the ways. I mean, whether it's Richie Incognito, football. This spans so many aspects of our American society that I sometimes bristle. And I'm not saying you're suggesting this, but when it's just focused on young black men, when really, we see elements of this culture on college campuses, on the football field, in movies. So I think it's a larger cultural shift that has to happen in our society.
Nope, I've got it. You're all set.
I think that you have articulated the problem eloquently. And what I would ask you is, if you had a magic wand to wave and you could figure out ways long-term to solve the problem, what things would you recommend?
Okay, well, for me, I mentioned some of the components of structural violence, which are institutionalized racism, failing school systems, and food deserts. You have to wipe things off like that. That's why we're doing food drives and things of that sort, because you need to go and attack the smaller components of structural violence in order to make structural violence just crumble as a whole. And since structural violence leads into direct violence, that's how you stop violence. So in my opinion, you have to stop the failing school systems, all of the schools that were shut down. That's going to lead into more violence. I don't understand I know it hasn't really shown right now, but there's going to be more violence because you're taking people from different communities and forcing them to be in another community where it's very unfamiliar for them. And once they get into that situation, there's people that's saying they don't need to be there, and there's people that's feeling like they're unwanted, and that's going to cause violence. So it needs to be more time spent in our educational system. There needs to be more opportunities for African Americans and Hispanics, and there needs to be more food that they can reach, organic foods. There needs to be more Whole Foods and Mariano's in our neighborhood, and that's going to take a lot of money and a lot of resources, but that's the way that you're going to stop direct violence.
I don't think they want you to.
Sorry, I've got time for 2 more questions. I can come over to you, but I've got her right now.
I've heard about black on black crime, and we've discussed it all afternoon. But I want to know why, when the white government and the white community has done so little for the blacks, why it contains itself to the black community. I've seen a few cases where some black youths come down to the city for trouble, but basically it's black on black crime, and I don't understand it.
There's no such thing as black on black violence. You kill people who live near you. And if you look at the white-on-white violence rates, they would be higher than black-on-black violence because there are more white people in this country.
And to speak to why you have this presence of the hood down on the Magnificent Mile, it's because the hood is so unsafe. Kids want to socialize. They want to go someplace where they feel safe. And down here, they feel safe. So they come down. But the mentality that they bring with them, unfortunately, sometimes, is the same mentality that happens at home, back in the neighborhood. So it's interesting, though. I've observed closely young people who come downtown. They act a little differently down here or here than they do back in the neighborhoods, because a lot of times they perceive that the consequences of their actions here are a lot less, I'm going to say consequences, there's no immediate response to their behavior, inappropriate behavior. So I was downtown waiting for my daughter, and I noticed some young guys. They were sitting on the hood or the trunk of a car, and they were kind of harassing people, talking to them. To them, it was fun. But as people were walking up and down the sidewalk saying stuff to them that, hey, man, that your girl to show, she sure is fine. You think I could take her out or something like that. They can do that here. Back in the neighborhood, you might get shot doing that. So, but to them, they're not thinking of the consequences and how that makes them look and the perception of, and how that affects the community here. But they just feel more comfortable here because they feel that it's a place that they are safe. And so that's what they, now, police presence, increased police presence solve that problem? Probably not, because a lot of the stuff that they engage in is really not criminal. It's just inappropriate social behavior. But that inappropriate social behavior back in the neighborhood might get you hurt seriously. So that's the difference. And that is the reason that a lot of young people from the neighborhoods come to this. Plus, it's so nice.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
Okay, this will be our last question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, can I comment on the last question? Okay, well, I believe that black-on-black violence is caused by a self-hate for yourself. When African Americans don't have a lot of information on their history, then they begin to hate what they are. When you have a limited amount of things, like the only thing you hear about is slavery, and when you hear about it, you only hear about it for a pinch of time. You don't know what you really came from. You don't know who you really are. You don't know if there's any royalty in your past, and you develop a self-hate for yourself because you hear so much about other people and their race and the ways that they came up in the world and the royalty that comes from them and the royalty in the world at that moment in time, that you develop a self-hate for your own color, of the color of your skin, because you hear of all of the bad things that happen. So once you're faced with a problem, you think it's because of me. And once you think it's because of you, you can look at someone else that looks exactly like you and take your pain and anger out onto them. That's why I think that black-on-black violence exists. And I think the only way that you could stop that is by exposing African American youth to their history properly, with a double side to it, not just a limited view.
Okay, we have one final question, and then we'll call it a day.
First, I think we're probably all very grateful for the opportunity to listen to you, because it's certainly a very enlightened and understanding perspective. While you were talking about the neighborhood, I was wondering, I had the impression that the police are doing something wrong in this whole process of trying to prevent crime, contain crime, and that, as you say, there aren't enough resources to do everything that's necessary. What do you think the police department could do to make a more positive difference?
Well, that's a good question. And two things I would say to that. Number one, I think the law enforcement approach to this problem is problematic in itself, because the problem is not a law enforcement problem. It's a structural, systemic, economic, cultural problem, right? It's an education, it's a misguided public policy problem. For instance, when we talk about the underfunding of public schools, it's not like there's not enough money for the schools. It's just that City Hall has decided we're not spending money. We're not investing money there. We're going to take TIF dollars and we're going to build stadiums for private institutions, and we're not going to give that money to schools to use to educate kids. That's the problem. And so when you have misguided public policy and you try to solve it with a law enforcement approach, it's going to be ineffective, right? So two things there. One, the police are not effective because it's not a law enforcement problem. And number two, there are resources, but the prioritizing of these resources is away from supporting things that would reduce violence.